Have you ever wondered how one split-second decision can haunt a person for a lifetime? This is a story filled with unimaginable choices and heartbreaking consequences, a tale that will leave you wondering what lies ahead at every turn. Don't miss a single chapter. Subscribe to our channel to follow each moment of this powerful journey. It was a rainy night in Manchester. The city lights glistened on the wet streets, casting a dim, melancholy glow over the hospital where Claire and James sat, watching over their newborn son. His name was Lucas, and he was swaddled tightly in a soft white blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. To anyone else, he might have looked like a perfect little bundle of joy, but to James, Lucas was a reminder of a reality he refused to accept. "Claire, we need to talk," James said, his voice low and strained. His hands were tightly clenched, his eyes fixed on the wall. Claire felt a chill run through her, sensing what was coming but praying she was wrong. She looked down at Lucas, who shifted slightly in his sleep, a small smile playing on his lips as if he were dreaming of something beautiful. "James, please don't say it," Claire whispered, tears already welling up in her eyes. But James wouldn't look at her. His jaw was set, his face a mask of cold determination as he took a deep breath. "Claire, this isn't the life we planned. He's different. We won't be able to handle this." Claire's heart shattered into a million pieces at his words. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had seen the same child James had, small and fragile, yes, but perfect in every way. Her instincts told her to hold him tighter, to protect him from the world that already seemed too harsh. "What are you saying, James?" she asked, though part of her already knew. "We can't take him home, Claire. We'd be doing him a favor by letting someone else care for him." His voice cracked, but he quickly cleared his throat, determined to keep his resolve. "Think of all the things we'd have to give up. The freedom, the future we talked about. Claire, this isn't the life we wanted." For a moment, the room was completely silent, save for the soft hum of the machines around them. Claire felt like the ground was slipping from beneath her feet. She looked down at Lucas, who yawned and curled his tiny fist around her finger, completely unaware of the cruel reality waiting outside these walls. "James, please, he's our son," she whispered, her voice barely audible. But James was firm. "Claire, this is the best thing for everyone. You'll see, someday." Claire's heart pounded in her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout that James was wrong, that Lucas was meant to be with them. But somewhere deep inside, she felt an overpowering wave of guilt, of doubt that maybe, just maybe, James was right. How could they give Lucas everything he would need? That night, under the cover of darkness, they left the hospital. James led Claire by the hand, his grip strong and unwavering, as if by sheer force he could silence her heart's protests. In his arms, he carried Lucas, bundled and silent, as the rain began to fall, each drop icy against Claire's skin. "James, wait, please, don't do this," she begged, but her voice was weak, barely a whisper against the pounding rain. "We have to, Claire." "We have to," he replied, his tone resolute, though there was a tremor in his voice that betrayed his own fear. They walked through a deserted alleyway behind the hospital. The dim light from a distant street lamp cast eerie shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of rain-soaked concrete. Without another word, James knelt down and gently placed Lucas in a sheltered corner beside a stack of empty boxes, under a rusted, creaking fire escape. Claire's knees nearly buckled as she watched, feeling as though her heart was being torn from her chest. She dropped down beside Lucas, tears streaming down her face as she whispered to him, holding his tiny hand in hers for what felt like both an eternity and a fleeting moment. "Forgive me," she choked out, barely able to form the words. "Oh, Lucas, forgive me." James placed a firm hand on her shoulder, pulling her back. "Claire, it's time to go." She looked down one last time, etching every detail of Lucas's face into her memory, before allowing herself to be led away, her heart breaking with every step. They turned the corner, leaving Lucas alone in the cold, wet night. Claire could barely see through her tears, but in that moment, she knew that the choice they'd made would haunt her forever. She felt hollow, like a shell of herself, as if a part of her had been left behind in that dark alley. The rain poured down harder as they walked away, and somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of an infant cut through the night like a knife. The cold morning light crept over Manchester, revealing a city slowly waking to the sound of rain dripping from the rooftops and the hum of early traffic. In a quiet corner behind the hospital, Lucas lay silent, barely stirring in his damp blanket, his face pale but peaceful, as if unaware of the world that had so cruelly abandoned him. By pure chance, Anna, a young nurse with a heart that seemed to beat in time with the compassion she felt for others, stepped out of the hospital's back entrance that morning. She had finished an exhausting night shift and was desperate for fresh air. But as she took in a breath, something caught her eye, a small bundle against the grey concrete, almost blending into the shadows. For a moment, she froze, her breath suspended. She had heard stories of abandoned children but had never encountered one. She approached cautiously, the realization dawning on her in stages, like watching a distant train come hurtling towards you, faster and faster until you could no longer deny it. "Oh, my God," she whispered as she knelt down, her hands trembling as she carefully lifted the edge of the blanket to reveal the tiny face underneath. Lucas's small eyes opened briefly, his gaze finding hers with a flicker of life. His soft whimper cut through the silence, and Anna's heart shattered right there in the alley. She cradled him close, pressing his little body against her own, trying to warm him with what little heat she had left after the cold night. Tears streamed down her face as she rocked him gently, her mind reeling with questions and fury at how someone could leave such an innocent soul in a place like this. But anger would have to wait. Right now, Lucas needed warmth, safety, and love, things she promised herself he would receive if she had any say in it. With Lucas wrapped securely in her arms, Anna rushed him back inside the hospital. She pushed through the door, her mind spinning as she tried to make sense of everything. Nurses, doctors, and patients alike turned to watch as she made her way through the ward, clutching the baby close to her chest. Once she reached her colleague Mary, an older nurse with years of experience and a wisdom that was nearly tangible, Anna broke down. "Mary! I found him." Left alone, just left, her words barely escaped her lips as her voice cracked with emotion. Mary's face softened, her eyes filling with a shared sadness. Without a word, she guided Anna to a quiet room where they could tend to Lucas in peace. Together, they checked his vitals, warming him up and watching over him as if he were their own. Anna couldn't help but feel a surge of protectiveness, an instinct as fierce as if she had carried him herself. As the morning unfolded, the story of the abandoned baby spread through the hospital. People whispered, some in horror, others in pity, all with an underlying sense of disbelief. The police were called, as was protocol, but the case quickly hit a dead end. With no witnesses and no identifying marks or possessions, there was little hope of finding Lucas's family. Anna couldn't shake the feeling that someone would come back for him, that a mother's heart, no matter how strained, would never allow such a cruel abandonment. But as the hours turned into days, and the days into weeks, no one came. The reality was undeniable. One evening, as Anna sat by Lucas's crib, watching him sleep, Mary joined her. She placed a comforting hand on Anna's shoulder and sighed deeply. "Anna, I've seen it before. Sometimes people just can't cope with what life hands them," Mary said gently, though her words carried a sadness that told Anna she had never fully accepted it herself. "How could anyone abandon their own child?" Anna asked, a knot of anger tightening in her chest. "Fear. Desperation. It's no excuse," but Mary shook her head. "The world isn't as kind as we'd like to believe." But Anna wasn't satisfied with this answer. She promised herself that Lucas would never feel abandoned again, not as long as she could help it. Eventually, the foster system stepped in, taking Lucas under its wing and transferring him to a temporary home. It was an ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood, but to Lucas, it was his first real home. Anna's heart broke as she watched him leave, feeling as though a part of herself was leaving with him. She wanted to adopt him herself, but as a young, single nurse, her resources were limited, and her life was too uncertain. All she could do was hope that he would find a loving family. Yet, the journey for Lucas would not be simple. His foster carers, though kind on the surface, were overwhelmed and unprepared for the unique needs of a child like Lucas. They provided food, clothing, and shelter, but there was no warmth, no tenderness, no connection. To them, Lucas was another responsibility, another duty. And to Lucas, the world began to feel cold and unyielding. Over time, Lucas grew used to the loneliness, to the detached glances and the hurried tones. At night, he would lie in his cot, looking up at the shadows on the ceiling, imagining faces, warmth, love, things he barely understood but instinctively longed for. And as he grew older, his longing transformed into an aching need to belong, to be held, to be someone's little boy. One day, Anna came to visit him, fulfilling a promise she had made to herself. She brought with her a small stuffed bear, a token of love in an otherwise empty world. As soon as he saw her, Lucas's face lit up, and he reached out with tiny hands, as if recognizing her from the early days when she had cradled him in that cold hospital room. She held him close, her heart swelling with love and sorrow, wishing she could do more. "I'm so sorry, little one," she whispered, holding back tears. "I wish things were different." But soon, the visit was over, and Anna had to leave, her footsteps echoing down the empty hallway, leaving Lucas with nothing but the small bear as a reminder of warmth. As time wore on, Lucas moved through different foster homes, each more indifferent than the last. He learned quickly that people came and went, that promises were fleeting, and that love was something elusive, something that only existed in dreams. By the time he turned 4, Lucas had almost given up hope of finding a family that would truly love him. He became withdrawn, his imagination his only refuge, creating stories in his mind where he was the hero, where he was loved, cherished, and wanted. But fate, it seemed, wasn't done with him just yet. One evening, an elderly couple arrived at his latest foster home. Their names were Grace and Henry, and from the moment they saw Lucas, something shifted. Grace, with her gentle smile and warm, welcoming eyes, felt an instant connection. And Henry, though quieter, felt his heart soften in a way he hadn't felt in years. As Lucas stared at the strangers in the doorway, his small hand gripping his worn teddy bear, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of hope, a spark he thought he had long since buried. Grace knelt down to his level, her voice soft and filled with kindness. "Hello, Lucas," she whispered. "Would you like to come home with us?" Lucas looked up at her, eyes wide, searching her face for any sign of deception. But all he saw was warmth, genuine and true. A tear slipped down his cheek as he nodded, unable to find the words. And as he took Grace's hand, a feeling of belonging began to bloom within him, fragile yet undeniable. But as the door closed behind them, a shadow from the past lingered, a reminder that love, once broken, does not easily mend. Grace and Henry's home was a small cottage in the countryside, with a thatched roof and a quaint garden that bloomed with roses and lavender. It was the kind of place where one could imagine a simpler, gentler life. For Lucas, it was a world unlike anything he'd known, a place that seemed to whisper promises of warmth, safety, and love. As they drove up to the cottage, Lucas sat in the back seat, clutching the teddy bear Anna had given him. He stared out the window, wide-eyed, unsure if this place could really be his new home. Grace looked back at him through the rearview mirror, her gentle smile a balm to his uncertainty. When they finally arrived, Henry helped him out of the car, and Grace held his hand as they walked up the stone path to the front door. "Welcome home, Lucas," she whispered, as if the words were a spell, casting away the loneliness and fear that had been his only companions for so long. Inside, the house was cozy, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and the warmth of a crackling fire. On the walls hung pictures of Grace and Henry's life together, memories of laughter and family, now faded with time. Lucas felt like he'd stepped into someone else's story, and part of him feared he wouldn't belong here, that this would all vanish like the fragile dreams he'd crafted in his mind. Grace knelt beside him, gently brushing a strand of his hair from his forehead. "Would you like to see your room?" Lucas nodded, his heart racing with hope and fear all at once. She led him down a narrow hallway to a small bedroom with a window that overlooked the garden. Inside, the bed was made up with a handmade quilt, and there was a shelf filled with books and toys carefully chosen just for him. This is mine," he whispered, barely able to believe it. "Yes, darling," "This is yours," Grace replied, her eyes shining with the love and kindness he'd yearned for. "Whenever you're ready, you can make it your own." Lucas ran his fingers over the quilt, feeling the stitches beneath his fingertips. He took in the small details, the books lined up neatly, the soft teddy bear perched on the bed, the gentle light filtering in through the window. For the first time, he felt the faint stirrings of hope, a warmth seeping into the cold corners of his heart. That night, as he lay beneath the quilt, Lucas found himself drifting to sleep with a peace he'd never known. He closed his eyes, the memories of the hospital and the cold, indifferent foster homes fading away, replaced by the quiet safety of his new room. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas slowly began to settle into his new life with Grace and Henry. He discovered a love for gardening, helping Henry tend to the roses and lavender that grew around the cottage. Grace taught him to bake, her hands guiding his through the steps of kneading dough, laughing as flour dusted his nose. But despite the warmth of his new family, shadows from his past lingered, dark and unyielding. At night, when the house grew quiet, memories crept in, the cold alleyway, the silence of those early days in the foster homes. He would clutch his teddy bear tightly, eyes squeezed shut as he tried to banish the fear and loneliness that haunted him. Grace and Henry noticed the sadness that sometimes clouded his face, the way he'd fall silent, lost in thoughts they couldn't reach. They didn't press him for answers, understanding that healing would take time. Instead, they showered him with quiet acts of love, a hand on his shoulder, a warm cup of tea, a gentle story before bed. They gave him space, hoping that, in time, he would trust them enough to open his heart. One afternoon, as they sat together in the garden, Henry spoke up, his voice soft yet firm. "Lucas, you know, you're safe here. No one will ever hurt you again." Lucas looked down, fiddling with the hem of his shirt. He wanted to believe Henry, but deep down, he was afraid that love was as fragile as the dandelions he blew into the wind, beautiful yet fleeting. Seeing his hesitation, Grace knelt beside him, her face gentle and kind. "Lucas, whatever has happened before, it doesn't have to control your life now. We're here for you, and we always will be. You're part of our family." Lucas looked up, meeting her gaze, and for the first time, he felt the weight of her words. Could he truly trust them? Was it possible that someone could love him unconditionally, without fear or regret? The months passed, and gradually, Lucas found himself opening up, little by little. His imagination flourished, and he began to create stories, wild, vivid tales of knights and dragons, of children who found homes in enchanted forests. Grace and Henry would sit by the fire, listening as he spun his stories, their eyes shining with pride and wonder. One evening, as he finished a tale of a boy who overcame impossible odds, Grace clapped her hands, her eyes misty with tears. "Lucas, you have such a gift. Your stories, they make people feel alive." Lucas blushed, ducking his head, but a small smile tugged at his lips. For the first time, he felt seen, his stories cherished instead of dismissed. However, one rainy afternoon, a visitor arrived, a woman from the foster care agency. She came with a stern face and a clipboard, casting a shadow over the cozy warmth of the cottage. Grace and Henry welcomed her in, but there was a tension in the air as they sat in the living room. Lucas hid behind the doorway, his heart pounding as he listened. The woman spoke in a cold, matter-of-fact tone. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, I'm here to inform you of some new regulations. Because of your age, the agency may need to reassess Lucas's placement with you." Grace's face paled, and Henry clenched his fists, his voice trembling with controlled anger. "But he's our son. We've given him a home, a family. How could you consider taking him away? I understand your feelings, Mr. Thompson, but it's about what's best for the child," the woman replied, her tone void of empathy. Hidden around the corner, Lucas felt as if the ground was slipping away beneath him. Would he be taken away again? Just as he was beginning to trust, to believe he had found a real home? Grace, tears in her eyes, took a steadying breath. "Please, give us a chance. Lucas has finally found peace here. I beg you, don't take him from us." The woman hesitated, glancing at her clipboard. "I'll note your concerns. But I can't make any promises. The final decision rests with the agency. With that, she left, leaving a suffocating silence in her wake. Lucas emerged from his hiding place, his eyes wide with fear. He looked up at Grace, his voice trembling. Are they going to take me away? Grace dropped to her knees, wrapping her arms around him tightly. No, Lucas. I promise you, we'll do everything we can to keep you here with us. But that night, as Lucas lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was once again slipping through his fingers. The thought of being torn from Grace and Henry, from the only home that had ever truly felt like his, filled him with a dread he couldn't express. And somewhere deep in his heart, a memory stirred, the faint echo of his mother's voice, her final words as she left him in that cold alleyway. The emptiness he'd thought he had left behind threatened to engulf him once more, and he clutched his teddy bear close, praying that this home, this love, would somehow be strong enough to last. A quiet dread hung over Grace and Henry's cottage in the days following the visit from the agency. The warmth and security that had filled the home felt fractured, like a favorite old mug chipped at the edge, ready to crumble if one more piece broke away. Lucas had retreated into himself, spending more time alone, his bright, adventurous stories replaced by quiet drawings of castles surrounded by walls and moats, fortresses meant to protect and keep intruders out. Grace noticed how he now clung to her hand when they walked to town, his little fingers holding on tightly, as though letting go meant losing everything. Each night, he lay awake, listening to the soft voices of Grace and Henry murmuring in the other room, planning, hoping, clinging to any solution that would let them stay together. One evening, Henry sat with Lucas by the fire, the flickering flames casting shadows across his weathered face. Lucas, he began, his voice steady but his eyes betraying his worry, do you remember the story about the little knight you told us last week? The one who built a fortress and guarded it all on his own. Lucas nodded slowly, his gaze fixed on the fire. Well, sometimes, even the strongest knights need a little help. And sometimes, those who love him most will do anything to make sure he's safe, Henry continued, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. Even if they try to take him away? Lucas asked, his voice barely a whisper. Henry's face softened. He looked down at Lucas, his own eyes glistening. Yes, even then, he murmured. We'll fight for you, Lucas, no matter what. But despite their promises, the looming possibility of separation grew heavier, casting a long, dark shadow over their lives. Grace and Henry had begun to prepare for the worst, secretly visiting lawyers, filling out forms, and spending their savings to keep Lucas with them. Every glance they exchanged seemed to carry an unspoken question, would it be enough? Then, one cold November morning, as Lucas sat at the kitchen table drawing another castle, a letter arrived in a plain white envelope. Grace held it in her trembling hands, her eyes wide as she looked at Henry, who nodded, urging her to open it. As she unfolded the letter, her face drained of color. She handed it to Henry, who read it in silence, his expression darkening with every line. The agency had decided Lucas would be moved to a new foster family due to Grace and Henry's age, claiming that they lacked the ability to care for him long term. No, Grace whispered, her voice shaking. They can't, after everything. Lucas looked up, sensing the fear in her voice. What is it, Grace? He asked, his eyes wide, searching her face for an answer. Grace forced a smile, but her eyes were misty. She knelt down next to him, her hand gently cupping his face. Lucas, I want you to remember something very important. You are loved, deeply loved, and no one can ever take that away from you. But Lucas knew. He understood enough to know that this was goodbye, and he felt the world he had started to build slipping away once more. The day came too soon. Grace and Henry packed a small suitcase for Lucas, filling it with his favorite books, clothes, and the teddy bear he'd had since his days in the foster system. They said nothing, the silence speaking of a grief too large for words. As they drove into the city to meet with the agency, Lucas sat between them in the back seat, his small hands clutching the bear. Grace's hand reached back every few minutes, giving his leg a gentle squeeze, a small reassurance she could barely feel herself. She and Henry shared quiet looks in the rearview mirror, each one a silent promise that they would keep fighting. At the agency, they were met by a woman with a crisp grey suit and an expression as unfeeling as the sterile white walls around them. She took Lucas's hand, pulling him gently but firmly away from Grace and Henry. The finality of her grip, the ease with which she separated him from them, felt like a betrayal in itself. "Please, please, we need more time," Grace begged, reaching out for Lucas as if she could pull him back by sheer will. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Thompson, but the decision has been made," the woman replied coolly, her eyes flicking dismissively over Grace and Henry. "It's in Lucas's best interests to be placed with a younger family who can provide long-term stability." Lucas's heart raced as he looked back at Grace and Henry, his world spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and fear. "Grace! Henry," he called out, reaching for them, but the woman pulled him further away, her grip tightening as though he were simply an object to be transferred, rather than a child with a heart full of love and dreams. Tears streamed down Grace's face, and Henry clenched his fists, his face lined with despair and frustration. As Lucas was led out of the building, he turned, catching one last look at the people who had given him the only true home he had ever known. In the days that followed, Lucas was placed in a new foster home with a young couple. Their house was large and filled with all the modern comforts, big windows, polished floors, a shiny new television. But to Lucas, it felt cold, too perfect, and utterly unfamiliar. There were no quiet evenings by the fire, no roses blooming outside the window, no smell of fresh bread filling the kitchen. The couple tried to be kind, but they didn't understand Lucas's silence, his reluctance to engage, his longing for the life he had lost. They bought him toys, fancy clothes, even a tablet, but he felt no warmth, no love. Every night, he lay awake in his unfamiliar bed, clutching his teddy bear, imagining he was back in Grace and Henry's cottage, surrounded by the only love he had ever known. One evening, the foster father noticed Lucas sitting by the window, looking out into the dark, his small figure illuminated by the faint light from the street lamp outside. "Lucas, what are you doing?" "You should be in bed," he said, a slight irritation in his voice. Lucas looked up at him, his eyes distant. "I'm waiting for Grace and Henry," he whispered, barely audible. The man frowned. "Lucas, you need to forget about them. This is your home now." But Lucas didn't answer. He simply turned back to the window, his heart aching with a longing so fierce it felt like it might tear him apart. As winter closed in, Lucas's new foster parents became increasingly frustrated with his quiet defiance, his refusal to settle in. They couldn't understand his grief, his unwavering hope that Grace and Henry would somehow come back for him. In their frustration, they began to limit his activities, keeping him in his room more often, trying to control his behavior with rigid rules and cold discipline. One night, as he sat alone in his room, Lucas felt a darkness creeping over him, a sense of despair that he couldn't shake. He clutched his teddy bear tightly, whispering to it as though it could understand. "I don't belong here," he murmured, his voice breaking. "Grace, Henry, please come back for me." But no answer came, only the empty silence of the room and the hollow ache in his chest. Then, one cold, snowy evening, there was a knock on the door. Lucas sat up in bed, his heart pounding as he strained to hear the voices downstairs. Muffled sounds drifted up through the house, the low tones of his foster parents, and then, unmistakably, a woman's voice, familiar and soft. His breath caught in his throat, his heart racing with a hope he dared not believe. He crept to the top of the stairs, peering down into the hallway. And there, framed in the doorway, stood Grace, her face lined with exhaustion and worry but filled with an unbreakable determination. Lucas's eyes filled with tears as he watched her, the sight of her filling the empty spaces in his heart. She had come for him. Despite everything, she had come. Without thinking, he ran down the stairs, his footsteps echoing through the house as he flung himself into her arms. Grace held him close, her own tears flowing freely as she whispered, "Oh, Lucas. I promised you I'd come back. I promised, and here I am." Behind them, the foster parents looked on, confusion and annoyance flickering across their faces, but Grace didn't care. She held Lucas tightly, as if by her embrace alone she could keep him safe. But as they clung to each other, a cold voice cut through the reunion. "Mrs. Thompson, I'm afraid you're not allowed to take him." He's under our guardianship now, and you need to leave." Grace looked up, her expression defiant. "This child belongs with us. We're his family." But as the words left her lips, a terrible realization dawned. The legal system was still against her, and there were forces determined to keep Lucas from her and Henry. The struggle was far from over, and though she held Lucas close, her heart ached with the knowledge that their battle was only just beginning. Grace held Lucas tightly in the foster parents' hallway, her face buried in his hair, inhaling the familiar scent of the little boy she'd come to love as her own. She could feel his small fingers clinging to her coat, trembling, his head pressed against her shoulder. It was as if he, too, understood that in this moment, they were standing on the edge of something they couldn't change. But then, the social worker's cold voice echoed again through the hallway, breaking the fragile moment. "Mrs. Thompson," she said firmly, "we need to discuss the future of Lucas's care. You must understand that you cannot take him from here. Your guardianship was reviewed and revoked. Lucas will stay with the foster family until we determine a permanent placement." Lucas's foster parents stood behind the social worker, their arms crossed, uncomfortable expressions on their faces. They watched Grace with a mixture of impatience and confusion, but Grace had eyes only for Lucas. She knelt down, holding his small face in her hands, and looked deeply into his tear-filled eyes. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice breaking, "I need you to remember something, no matter what happens. You are loved, do you hear me? You are loved so very much." He nodded, his lip trembling as he held back tears. "But I want to come home with you. I want to go back to the garden and the roses and Henry." His voice was so small, and Grace's heart shattered at the longing she saw in his gaze. "I know, my darling, I know," she whispered, brushing a tear from his cheek with her thumb. "We'll find a way. Somehow, we'll find a way." But the social worker stepped forward, her patience clearly waning. "Mrs. Thompson, please. This is for Lucas's stability and long-term welfare. He needs to settle here. This continued contact is confusing for him." The coldness of her words sliced through Grace like a knife. How could they say that severing Lucas's ties to the only home he'd ever known was in his best interests? But she knew she had no choice but to obey, at least for now. She could see it in the woman's unyielding expression, and in the stern looks of the foster parents. It was as if Lucas were a prize in a game they were determined to win, his own wishes lost in the process. With a heart weighed down by despair, Grace stood up, took a deep breath, and gave Lucas a final, lingering look. She wished she could hold him forever, shield him from this heartbreak, but her hands were tied. The social worker gestured towards the door, and with one last squeeze of Lucas's hand, Grace let go, her eyes brimming with tears she couldn't hide. Lucas's small voice broke through the silence. "Don't go, Grace. Please don't leave me here." Her heart clenched painfully, but she forced a shaky smile, trying to be strong for him. "I'll be back, Lucas. Remember, you're not alone. You're in our hearts, every day, and we'll find a way, I promise." But as she walked out of the house, leaving Lucas behind, a sense of finality washed over her. She could still feel the warmth of his small hand in hers, but the space around her felt suddenly cold and empty. She turned back for one last glance, catching sight of Lucas through the window, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wide with confusion and hurt. The sight tore through her, leaving her feeling hollow and helpless. Days passed in a blur of despair and worry for Grace and Henry. They spent countless hours meeting with lawyers, petitioning the agency, writing letter after letter, and pleading their case before endless social workers. But every door they knocked on seemed to close in their faces, and each day that went by, their hopes grew fainter. In the meantime, Lucas withdrew further. The foster home was spacious and well-kept, but cold in a way he couldn't describe. There were no late-night stories by the fire, no soft lullabies to calm his dreams, and no gentle hands to hold him when he felt scared. The new foster parents tried to be kind in their own way, but Lucas knew he didn't belong there. He spent most of his time sitting by the window, watching the empty street, hoping to see Grace's familiar figure walking up the drive. The foster mother tried to console him with new toys and sweets, but Lucas barely noticed them. When he wasn't waiting by the window, he would lie in bed clutching his worn teddy bear, his only reminder of the love he'd once known. Each day felt like an eternity, stretching out before him in endless silence. One night, as the rain poured down outside, Lucas lay awake in the dark, the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him. He closed his eyes tightly, whispering into the silence, "Grace, Henry, please come back. Please don't forget me." Meanwhile, Grace and Henry had spent the last of their savings on legal fees and were nearing a breaking point. Their once lively cottage was now silent, the garden untended, the roses drooping without the loving care Lucas had given them. Each evening, Grace would sit by the window, her gaze fixed on the road as though hoping Lucas would somehow find his way home. One late evening, Henry found her sitting there, her face pale and tear-streaked. He placed a hand on her shoulder, but she barely acknowledged him, her thoughts lost in a painful swirl of memories. "I can't stand this, Henry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Every night, I can still hear him calling for me. I feel like we're losing him, piece by piece." Henry knelt beside her, taking her hand in his. "We've done everything we could, Grace." "Everything," he murmured, his voice thick with grief. "But we're not giving up. Not yet. Lucas is our son, and we'll fight until there's no more fight left in us." They held each other in silence, their grief shared yet overwhelming, both of them clinging to the faintest hope that they could find a way back to Lucas. But the strain had taken its toll, and their once peaceful home now felt haunted, each empty room a reminder of the laughter that no longer filled it. Then, a letter arrived, cutting through the stillness like a knife. Grace opened it with trembling hands, her eyes scanning the words quickly, and as she read, her face paled, her expression crumpling in despair. It was from the agency, informing them that Lucas's foster placement was now permanent and that any further visits or attempts at contact would be prohibited. For a moment, Grace simply stood there, the letter falling from her fingers as she stared blankly at the wall. She felt as though her heart had shattered into a million pieces, each one cutting deeper than the last. Henry picked up the letter, reading it slowly, his own face filled with shock and grief. He reached for Grace, but she pulled away, her anguish too raw, too overwhelming to bear. They can't do this, Henry," she choked out, her voice breaking. "He's our boy. They can't just take him away like this." But the letter's words were unyielding, and with each line, the reality of their loss sank deeper, a wound that would never heal. Grace felt as if the air had been stolen from her lungs, as though she were drowning in a sea of grief and helplessness. That night, for the first time in their marriage, Grace and Henry sat in silence, neither able to find the words to console the other. The life they had known, the love they had built with Lucas, was slipping away, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. As Grace lay in bed, her thoughts spiraled back to Lucas, to his small hand holding hers, to the way his eyes sparkled when he told his stories by the fire. She remembered his laughter, his tender way of caring for the roses, and the soft, gentle feeling of his head resting on her shoulder. The next morning, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Grace knew what she had to do. She rose quietly, her heart heavy but resolute. She looked back at Henry, who was still asleep, his face lined with the grief of their shared loss. She gently kissed his forehead, a silent goodbye. Grace walked out of the house, down the path they had once walked together with Lucas. She didn't know where she was going or how she would find him, but she knew she couldn't simply stay there, frozen in grief, waiting for a miracle that might never come. That afternoon, Lucas sat by the window in the foster home, watching the empty road, as he had done every day since he'd been taken away. He was lost in thought, his heart aching with longing, when he saw a figure appear on the distant horizon. He squinted, his heart pounding as he leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. The figure moved slowly but steadily, each step bringing them closer, and he could make out the familiar shape of her coat, the way she walked, her posture. "Grace," he whispered, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. He ran to the door, his small feet barely touching the ground as he flew down the steps and out into the cold winter air. Tears streamed down his face as he ran, his heart bursting with a hope he hadn't dared to feel. But just as he reached the front yard, he was stopped by the foster mother, her hand gripping his shoulder firmly. "Lucas, get back inside. Now." Lucas struggled against the foster mother's firm grip, his heart racing as he watched Grace approaching, her figure blurry through the tears filling his eyes. She was here, walking towards him, her face a mixture of hope and sorrow. But he couldn't reach her, couldn't break free from the hand holding him back. "Lucas, you need to go inside," the foster mother said, her tone stern but weary. She glanced at Grace, her expression hardening as she led Lucas back towards the door. "This isn't what's best for you, Lucas. Grace isn't your family." Lucas's small voice trembled as he spoke, his eyes fixed on Grace through the closing door. "But she is my family." Through the gap of the door, Grace's gaze met his, and in that moment, a silent promise passed between them, a promise to fight, no matter the cost. She raised a hand in a gentle wave, and though her face held a sadness deeper than words, there was a fierce determination in her eyes. As the door clicked shut, Lucas's heart sank. He stood there in the cold, silent hallway, feeling as if the last sliver of light had been snatched away. Later that evening, Grace sat alone on a bench outside the foster agency, her hands trembling as she clutched a worn photograph of Lucas, the only image she had of him. She gazed at his face, the wide, hopeful eyes that once looked at her with so much trust, and she felt a surge of resolve. The door to the agency opened, and the social worker, the same woman who had kept them apart that morning, walked out. Grace seized the moment, standing up and blocking her path. "Please," she began, her voice cracking. "You don't understand. Lucas is our son. He belongs with us, with people who love him." The social worker's expression remained impassive. "Mrs. Thompson, I've explained this to you already. The agency has determined what's best for Lucas. He's in a stable environment now, with younger carers who are more prepared to meet his needs long term." Grace's eyes filled with anger, a fire sparking in her chest. "He needs love, not just stability. He needs to know he's safe, that someone in this world cares for him without conditions. You're treating him like an item to be handled, not a child who's already suffered more than he should." The social worker hesitated, glancing away before clearing her throat. "The decision is final. There's nothing more to discuss." With those words, she turned and walked away, leaving Grace standing in the cold, clutching the photograph as though it were her only lifeline. Grace returned home that night feeling defeated, the weight of hopelessness pressing down on her. When she walked in, she found Henry sitting by the fire, his eyes reflecting his own silent grief. "He's hurting, Henry," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I saw it in his eyes. "He doesn't understand why he's being kept away from us. We're his family. We're the only real home he's known." Henry reached out, pulling her into a tight embrace, his hand gently stroking her hair. "Grace, we've done everything we can. The agency, the courts, the lawyers, no one will listen. They've made up their minds. But we can't give up," she murmured, her voice filled with desperation. "We can't just let them take him from us." Henry closed his eyes, nodding slowly. "Then we'll keep fighting. Whatever it takes, Grace. We'll fight for him until there's nothing left to fight for." The days turned into weeks, and Grace and Henry threw themselves into every possible avenue to bring Lucas home. They visited lawyers, wrote letters to the agency, and even went to court hearings, pleading their case. But every attempt was met with rejection, every plea dismissed by officials who saw Lucas as nothing more than a number in their system. And all the while, Lucas remained in the foster home, drifting through each day in a haze of sadness and confusion. The foster parents tried to coax him out of his silence, offering him new toys and treats, but nothing seemed to reach him. He spent most of his time by the window, waiting, watching, hoping that the familiar figures of Grace and Henry would somehow appear. One chilly afternoon, as he sat gazing out at the bleak winter landscape, a thought struck him with sudden clarity. He couldn't wait forever. If the world was keeping him from Grace and Henry, maybe he could find a way to reach them himself. That night, after everyone in the house had gone to bed, Lucas lay awake, his mind racing. He carefully slid out of bed, clutching his teddy bear in one hand, and tiptoed to the window. The ground was covered in a light dusting of snow, and the world outside was silent, almost magical. He felt a thrill of fear and excitement as he pulled on his coat and quietly opened the door. The cold air hit him as he stepped outside, but he was determined. He took a deep breath, his little heart pounding with both fear and courage, and set off down the snow-covered path, his small footprints marking his journey. The streets were unfamiliar, shadowed in the faint glow of street lamps. Every noise made him jump, but he pressed on, each step bringing him closer to the only home he'd ever known. Meanwhile, Grace sat up in bed, unable to sleep. An unexplainable worry gnawed at her, a sense that something wasn't right. She nudged Henry, who groaned sleepily. "Henry," she whispered, her voice filled with urgency. "I can't shake this feeling, like Lucas needs us." Henry rubbed his eyes, glancing at the clock. "Grace, it's the middle of the night. There's nothing we can do right now." She stared out the window, her heart pounding. "I know, but it feels like he's reaching out. Like he's calling to us." Henry sighed, sitting up and placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll see him again. I don't know how, but we will. Try to get some rest, love." But as Henry lay back down, Grace remained at the window, staring out into the darkness. She didn't know it yet, but at that very moment, Lucas was making his way through the unfamiliar streets, a small figure against the vast, shadowed cityscape. After what felt like hours, Lucas began to tire, his legs aching as he trudged through the snow. He was cold and hungry, his fingers numb as he clutched his teddy bear. He had no idea how far he'd gone or where he was, all he knew was that he had to keep going. Eventually, he stumbled upon a small park, the trees casting eerie shadows across the snow-covered ground. He found a bench beneath one of the trees and collapsed onto it, too exhausted to move any further. He huddled there, drawing his knees up to his chest, and pressed his face into his bear's soft fur. "Grace!" "Henry," he whispered, his voice trembling with exhaustion and longing. "Please find me." But the park was silent, the only sounds the distant hum of traffic and the rustle of the wind through the branches. Lucas closed his eyes, his small body shivering as he curled up on the bench, his hope fading with each passing moment. Meanwhile, back at the cottage, Grace was growing more restless by the minute. She finally stood up, unable to shake the nagging feeling gnawing at her heart. "Henry, I need to go for a drive," she said, her voice filled with urgency. "Something is wrong. I can feel it." Henry looked at her, worry creasing his brow. "Grace, it's the middle of the night. Where would you even go?" "I don't know," she replied, her voice cracking. "But I have to try. I have to know that he's safe." Seeing the desperation in her eyes, Henry nodded, grabbing his coat and keys. "I'm coming with you." Together, they climbed into the car, the engine roaring to life as they pulled out of the driveway. Grace clutched her seatbelt, her eyes scanning the dark streets as they drove through the quiet town, her heart pounding with an unshakable sense of dread. They passed street after street, their headlights cutting through the shadows, but there was no sign of Lucas. Just as they were about to turn back, Grace spotted a small figure curled up on a park bench, half buried in snow. "Henry, stop the car," she cried, her voice filled with panic. Henry slammed on the brakes, and they both jumped out, running towards the figure. As they drew closer, Grace's heart nearly stopped. It was Lucas, shivering and pale, his small face streaked with tears. "Lucas," she called, dropping to her knees beside him. "Oh, my darling, what are you doing here?" Lucas looked up, his eyes bright with relief and exhaustion. I was looking for you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Grace wrapped her arms around him, holding him close, tears streaming down her face. "Oh, Lucas, you're safe now. You're safe. We are here." Henry joined them, his face lined with worry as he gently rubbed Lucas's back. "We've got you, son. We'll never let go again." But even as they held him, the reality of their situation loomed over them. They knew that this reunion was fleeting, that they would have to return him, and the thought filled them with a sense of dread and helplessness. As dawn began to break, casting a pale light over the park, Grace held Lucas close, knowing that the battle for his future was far from over. As the first light of dawn crept over the park, Grace held Lucas close, feeling the warmth of his small, shivering body against her. She could feel his heartbeat slowing as he finally relaxed in her arms, safe and secure in the embrace he had longed for. Henry stood beside them, his eyes red with worry and exhaustion, his hand resting protectively on Lucas's shoulder. "We're taking him home," Grace whispered, her voice filled with determination. Henry nodded, but his face was etched with worry. "Grace, you know they'll come after us. They won't let him stay." "I don't care," she replied, tightening her arms around Lucas. "We've done everything they asked. We've obeyed every rule, gone to every court date, and still, they keep him from us. But look at him, Henry, he belongs with us." Lucas's eyes fluttered open at her words, a faint smile forming on his lips as he heard the promise in her voice. He nestled deeper into Grace's arms, clutching his teddy bear, as if he, too, knew this moment was fleeting, fragile. Henry sighed, glancing down at the little boy who had brought a spark back into their lives. "Let's go, then. We'll face whatever comes, but for now, let's take our boy home." They bundled Lucas into the back seat of the car, wrapping him in blankets and turning on the heater full blast. Grace kept glancing back as Henry drove, her heart aching at the sight of Lucas huddled there, his small body still shivering, but his eyes alight with hope. When they reached the cottage, the familiar sight of the roses, the ivy creeping up the walls, and the smoke curling from the chimney felt like a balm on Grace's weary heart. This was home, their home, and she would do anything to keep it that way for Lucas. Inside, they made him a warm bath, wrapped him in his favorite quilt, and gave him tea with honey, watching as he slowly returned to himself, the warmth of the fire reviving him. He sat on the couch between them, his head resting against Grace's shoulder as he closed his eyes, finally feeling at peace. They spent the morning in quiet happiness, sharing stories, laughter, and the warmth of a family reunited. Grace felt the heaviness of worry ease as Lucas's laughter filled the room once again. She held on to every moment, each one feeling like a stolen treasure. But by early afternoon, their fragile happiness was shattered by the sound of a car pulling up outside, followed by a loud knock at the door. Grace and Henry exchanged a glance, the color draining from their faces. Grace's hands began to shake, and she looked at Lucas, who clutched his teddy bear, his face filled with sudden fear. "Stay here, darling," she whispered, her voice trembling as she rose to answer the door. When she opened it, she was met with the cold, unyielding gaze of the social worker, flanked by two officers. Her expression was hard, lacking any trace of compassion. "Mrs. Thompson, you know why we're here." Grace stood firm, her hand gripping the doorframe. "Please, he belongs with us. He ran away to find us. Doesn't that tell you something?" The social worker's mouth was a thin line as she shook her head. "Lucas's well-being is our priority, Mrs. Thompson. We can't allow him to stay here." Henry stepped forward, his voice filled with anger and desperation. "You call this well-being? Taking him from the only family he's ever known, tearing him away after he's suffered so much?" The social worker didn't flinch. "This isn't a debate, Mr. Thompson. We're here to take Lucas back." Behind them, Lucas peeked around the doorframe, his eyes wide with fear as he watched the officers step forward. Grace turned to him, her heart breaking at the sight of his trembling hands, his face a mix of confusion and terror. "Lucas, come here, darling," she whispered, holding out her arms. He ran to her, burying his face in her shoulder as she held him close, her hand gently stroking his hair. "I love you, Lucas," she murmured, her voice choked with tears. "Always remember that. No matter what, you are loved." But the officers moved closer, one of them placing a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "Come on, son. It's time to go." Lucas clung to Grace, his little hands gripping her coat with all his might. "No. I want to stay here. I want to stay with Grace and Henry." His voice cracked with desperation, tears streaming down his face as he tried to hold on. The officer pulled him away, and Grace felt her world collapse as his small fingers slipped from hers. Henry stepped forward, but the social worker blocked his path, her face unyielding. "Please, don't take him," Grace whispered, her voice filled with despair. "You're destroying him. Can't you see that?" But the social worker didn't respond, her face as cold and indifferent as ever. She turned and led Lucas towards the car, his cries echoing in the quiet of the afternoon. Grace fell to her knees as the car pulled away, her hands covering her face as her heart shattered anew. Henry knelt beside her, his arms wrapping around her as they held each other in their grief, feeling the weight of the emptiness Lucas's absence left behind. In the days that followed, the cottage felt like a shell of what it once was. The laughter, the warmth, the sense of family had all disappeared, leaving only silence and the heavy ache of loss. Grace moved through each day in a daze, barely able to function as memories of Lucas haunted her every step. Henry tried to comfort her, but he too was drowning in the grief of losing their son. Their once lively garden withered, the roses drooping as if mourning alongside them, their petals falling like tears to the ground. And somewhere far away, Lucas lay in bed at his new foster home, clutching his teddy bear and staring at the ceiling, his heart numb with a sadness too heavy for words. He felt like a ghost, drifting through a life that didn't belong to him, his dreams filled with the distant memory of Grace's warm smile and Henry's gentle voice. But Grace and Henry refused to give up. They continued writing letters, filing appeals, pleading with the agency, insisting that Lucas belonged with them. Each letter they received in response was another rejection, another door slammed in their faces, but they kept going, driven by a love that wouldn't allow them to surrender. Months passed, and their spirits began to wane, the weight of their struggle taking its toll. Grace's health declined, her face growing pale and thin, her once bright eyes dull with exhaustion and sorrow. Henry watched her with growing concern, fearing that her broken heart would be her undoing. One evening, as they sat in the silence of their empty living room, Grace looked at Henry, her face lined with grief. "I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting, Henry," she whispered, her voice filled with despair. "It feels like we're losing him, piece by piece, and I don't know if I have the strength to keep going." Henry took her hand, his own eyes filled with tears. "Grace, he's our son. We can't give up on him. We may be the only people left in this world who truly care about what happens to him." She nodded, but her heart felt heavy, the fight draining her with each passing day. She had poured everything into bringing Lucas home, but the system seemed determined to keep him away, to keep them all trapped in an endless cycle of grief. Then, one grey autumn morning, a letter arrived, a letter that would change everything. Grace's hands trembled as she opened it, her heart racing with a flicker of hope she hadn't dared to feel in months. As she read the words on the page, her eyes filled with tears, her breath catching in her throat. "Henry, it's a hearing," she whispered, barely able to believe it. "They're giving us one more chance. They're actually giving us a hearing to plead our case." Henry's face lit up with a cautious hope, his hand covering hers as he looked into her eyes. "Then this is it, Grace. This is our chance to bring him home." The news sent a surge of energy through them, reigniting the fire that had nearly gone out. They spent every moment preparing, gathering letters from neighbors, friends, and anyone who could speak to the love and stability they had provided for Lucas. They poured their hearts into their statements, hoping, praying that someone, anyone, would see that Lucas belonged with them. The day of the hearing arrived, and they entered the courtroom with their heads held high, determined to fight for Lucas with everything they had left. As they took their seats, Grace reached for Henry's hand, her heart pounding as she looked across the room to where the agency's representatives sat, their faces unreadable. And as the judge entered, calling the room to order, Grace felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in months. This was their last chance, their final opportunity to bring Lucas home. But as the proceedings began, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight was far from over. The air was thick with tension as Grace and Henry sat in the quiet courtroom, their hands clasped tightly together. It was their final chance to bring Lucas home, and every fiber of their being was braced for the battle ahead. Across the aisle sat the agency's representatives, stone-faced and prepared, their files neatly stacked before them, their cold gazes unyielding. The judge, an elderly man with a solemn expression, entered and called the room to order. Grace and Henry's lawyer rose first, speaking eloquently about their love for Lucas, the stability they provided, and the irreplaceable bond they shared. Grace's heart swelled with hope as the lawyer painted a picture of their life together, the garden Lucas helped tend, the bedtime stories by the fire, the laughter that filled their home. But as the agency's lawyer stood to respond, a chill settled over Grace. His voice was sharp, calculated, each word cutting through their hope like a knife. "Your Honor," he began, his gaze fixed coldly on Grace and Henry. "While the Thompsons' dedication to Lucas is undeniable, it is not enough. At their age, they simply cannot offer him the long-term stability he requires. We have identified a younger family who has already been approved as adoptive parents, a family ready to provide for Lucas in ways that Grace and Henry simply cannot." Grace's heart sank as the lawyer continued, outlining every supposed disadvantage of her and Henry's age, every argument designed to make them seem unfit. She felt her throat tighten, her hands shaking as he painted a future for Lucas that didn't include them. Each word felt like a blow, and she could see the hope draining from Henry's face beside her. But it was the agency's final piece of evidence that struck the hardest. "Your Honor, we have one last testimony from Lucas's current foster parents," the lawyer announced, gesturing to the back of the room. Grace turned, her eyes widening as the foster parents rose and walked to the stand. The foster mother's gaze was cold, unfeeling, as she began to speak about Lucas's adjustment to their home, claiming that he had finally begun to settle and that removing him would only cause further emotional harm. "Lucas has started to bond with us," she said, her voice calm, rehearsed. "He is thriving in our care, and while we respect the Thompsons' love for him, we believe it is in his best interest to remain with us, where he is already established and stable." Grace felt a hollow ache fill her chest as the words sank in. Her hands clenched the edges of her seat, her mind reeling with disbelief. Thriving? How could they lie so easily? She knew Lucas was still waiting, still aching to come home to them. She could see it in his eyes every time they'd had to say goodbye. As the foster mother stepped down, Grace caught her eye, searching for some trace of understanding, some flicker of empathy. But all she saw was indifference, the look of someone who had already made up her mind. Then, the judge turned to Grace, his expression softening slightly as he nodded for her to speak. She rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and looked around the room, feeling the weight of every gaze on her. "Your Honor," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I know we are not young. I know we don't have the same future as some of the other families you could place Lucas with. But what we have is a lifetime of love. Lucas isn't just another child in our care, he is our son. We raised him. We watched him grow, helped him through his fears, his tears, his joys. He is part of us." Her voice cracked, and she paused, fighting to hold back the tears. She looked over at Henry, who gave her a small nod, his eyes filled with the same quiet determination she felt. "We don't have endless resources or perfect health," she continued, "but we have more love than we could ever give in a lifetime. And we know, that Lucas feels the same. He found his family with us, and we are asking you, begging you, to let him come home." The room fell silent as Grace finished, her heart pounding as she returned to her seat, her hand finding Henry's. She could feel his pulse racing, his hand warm and steady in hers, grounding her in the moment. After what felt like hours, the judge cleared his throat, glancing down at his notes before finally meeting Grace and Henry's gaze. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he began, his tone solemn. "I have carefully reviewed both sides, and I do not doubt the love you have for Lucas. Your dedication is clear, and it is moving." He paused, and Grace's heart leapt with a flicker of hope. But then, his face hardened, his eyes shifting to the foster parents, then back to Grace and Henry. "However, this court's duty is to serve the child's best long-term interests, and that requires considering his stability and future." Grace's heart sank as he continued. "Therefore," he said, his voice final, "the agency's decision will stand. Lucas will remain in his current placement, with the intention of adoption by his foster family." "I am sorry." The word struck Grace like a physical blow, and she felt herself gasp, the air stolen from her lungs as reality crashed down around her. Henry's face was white, his hand trembling in hers, and she felt as though the ground had fallen out from beneath them both. "No," she whispered, her voice a broken plea. "Please, you can't do this, he's our son." But the judge's face was already turned away, his decision final, his gavel falling like the toll of a death knell. In a daze, Grace and Henry left the courthouse, each step feeling as if it were carrying them further and further away from Lucas. They walked in silence, too numb to speak, too broken to find comfort in each other's presence. The life they had fought for, the future they had dreamed of, had been taken from them in the coldest, most calculated way possible. Back at the cottage, Grace wandered through the empty rooms, her gaze falling on Lucas's small bed, his toys, the book he had left open on his nightstand. Each item felt like a ghost, a reminder of the laughter and love that had once filled these walls. Henry found her standing in Lucas's room, her face pale and lost as she clutched one of his toys, her hands trembling. "He's gone, Henry," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "They've taken him from us. Truly, this time." Henry wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close as they both sank to the floor, their grief overwhelming, all-consuming. They held each other in the quiet of the empty house, their hearts shattered, their love for Lucas now trapped within walls that would never hear his laughter again. For weeks, they moved through life in a haze, carrying out each day's routine in silence. The garden, once tended lovingly by Lucas, grew wild and untamed. The roses began to wilt, their petals falling like silent tears onto the soil. Grace could barely look at them, each bloom a reminder of the boy who had cared for them with such gentle hands. One day, as they sat in the quiet of the living room, Henry broke the silence. "Grace, we can't let him go." She looked at him, her eyes dull, lifeless. "What more can we do, Henry? They've made their decision. They've taken him. But Lucas knows we love him," Henry continued, his voice steady with resolve. "We can still write to him. We can let him know that he isn't alone, that we're still here, waiting for him." Grace felt a flicker of hope stir within her, fragile but real. "Do you think they'd even let him receive our letters?" Henry's face softened. "If they don't, then at least we'll know we tried. And if he ever finds them, he'll know that we never stopped loving him." That evening, Grace sat at the small desk in Lucas's room, her hand shaking as she put pen to paper. She poured her heart into each line, telling him about the roses that missed his care, about the stories they still told by the fire, about how much they loved him, how they thought of him every moment of every day. They sent the letters to the agency, hoping, praying that Lucas would receive them, that their love would reach him even from afar. And somewhere, across town in a quiet foster home, Lucas sat by the window, staring out at the empty street, his heart aching with the memory of Grace and Henry. The days felt long and silent, each one stretching into the next, each one a reminder of the family he had lost. But one day, a letter arrived. It was a simple envelope, bearing his name in Grace's familiar handwriting. His foster mother handed it to him, her face unreadable, but Lucas barely noticed. He tore it open, his heart racing as he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning each line, each word a balm to his aching heart. As he read, a spark of hope flickered within him, a reminder that no matter what the world had taken from him, there were two people out there who loved him, who would always love him, who would never let him be forgotten. And with that letter clutched tightly in his hands, Lucas closed his eyes, feeling the warmth of Grace and Henry's love wrap around him, giving him the strength to hold on, to keep hoping, to keep believing that somehow, someday, they would find their way back to each other. Lucas read Grace's letter every night before bed, holding it close like a secret treasure. Each word was a lifeline, a reminder that he was not forgotten, that there was still love waiting for him, even if he couldn't be with Grace and Henry. He could almost hear Grace's gentle voice and feel Henry's reassuring hand on his shoulder as he read, the words filling his heart with a fragile hope that maybe, somehow, they would be together again. The foster home was quiet, the days passing in a repetitive blur. Though his foster parents tried to keep him busy with activities and school, they could never replace the warmth and love he'd found in Grace and Henry's cottage. Each evening, Lucas would sit by the window, staring at the empty street, his mind drifting to memories of the garden, the smell of freshly baked bread, and the comforting hum of bedtime stories shared by the fire. One morning, as Lucas was about to leave for school, his foster mother stopped him in the hallway. She glanced over her shoulder, as if ensuring no one else was listening, and handed him an envelope. "Here," she said curtly, her tone brisk. "Another letter from Grace. But don't go getting any ideas. This is where you belong now." Lucas took the letter eagerly, his heart pounding as he held it tightly. He nodded without replying, his mind already lost in anticipation of Grace's words. He waited until he was alone at school, away from watchful eyes, before slipping the envelope from his backpack. He opened it carefully, his hands trembling, and unfolded the letter, reading the familiar handwriting, each line a balm to his heart. "My dearest Lucas, I want you to know that no matter where you are, you're still with us. The roses in the garden miss your care, and the house feels quiet without your laughter. Every night, Henry and I talk about you, sharing stories and memories, hoping that you feel our love even across the miles. We may not be able to see you now, but we believe, with all our hearts, that this separation is only temporary. We are waiting for you, Lucas, and we'll never stop. You are our son, and that's something no court can ever change. With all the love in the world. Grace and Henry." The words wrapped around him like a warm blanket, filling him with a hope he had tried so hard to keep alive. He tucked the letter into his pocket, feeling a small but powerful strength surge within him, as if Grace and Henry's love had given him a renewed purpose. Back at the cottage, Grace and Henry continued to write letters faithfully, pouring their hearts into every word, describing life in the cottage and the love that awaited Lucas. But each letter sent was a reminder of the emptiness in their home, a quiet pain that lingered in every corner. The days grew shorter, the garden wilting as autumn turned to winter, and Grace found herself growing more frail, her spirit weighed down by the constant ache of loss. One evening, as she and Henry sat by the fire, a familiar knock sounded at the door. They exchanged a puzzled glance, not expecting anyone at such a late hour. Henry rose slowly, opening the door to find Anna, the nurse who had first found Lucas as a baby, standing there, her face pale but determined. "Anna?" Grace asked, her voice laced with surprise. "What are you doing here?" Anna stepped inside, glancing over her shoulder as if she were being followed. Her expression was one of urgency, her eyes meeting Grace's with a mixture of pain and resolve. "Grace, Henry," she began, her voice low, "there's something you need to know. I've kept this secret for too long, but after seeing what Lucas has been through, I can't hold it any longer." Grace and Henry exchanged a worried glance, both sensing that whatever Anna had to say would change everything. Anna took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the floor as she spoke. "The day I found Lucas, when he was abandoned at the hospital, I had no idea who had left him. But a few months later, I learned the truth. The agency, they covered up what really happened. Lucas wasn't just abandoned. He was taken from his biological mother under conditions that, well, let's just say there were bribes involved, and the agency benefited financially from placing him with a new family." Grace's hand flew to her mouth as a gasp escaped her. "But why would they do that?" Anna looked up, her eyes filled with sorrow. "Because the agency makes more money with each new placement. And his biological mother, she didn't have the means to fight them. She was pressured, manipulated, and finally forced to give him up. And since then, they've been using the same tactics to keep him in foster care, placing him in homes where they can profit from his care." Henry's fists clenched, his face flushed with anger. "They've been moving him from family to family just for profit? Denying him the love and stability he deserves?" "Yes," Anna replied, her voice shaking. "And when I saw what they were doing to you, to Lucas, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. I've been gathering evidence, letters, files, everything I could find. And I'm willing to testify to help you bring him home, to expose the agency for what it truly is." Grace's heart raced as she processed Anna's words, her mind reeling with the revelation. They had spent years fighting, pleading, and praying, only to be thwarted by a system built on greed. But now, for the first time, they had a real chance, a way to expose the truth, to reunite with Lucas, and to bring him home. "Thank you, Anna," Grace whispered, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. "You've given us a hope we thought was lost." Anna nodded, her face resolute. "Lucas deserves a family. He deserves to know he is loved and that he was never unwanted. The next morning, Grace, Henry, and Anna met with a new lawyer, a compassionate man named Mr. Caldwell, who had a reputation for challenging corrupt institutions. After hearing their story, he agreed to take on their case, vowing to help them fight the agency and expose the truth behind Lucas's forced separation. Over the following weeks, they prepared meticulously, gathering witness statements, documentation, and every piece of evidence Anna had uncovered. Grace and Henry felt a renewed sense of purpose, each day bringing them one step closer to reclaiming the family they had lost. Finally, the day of the trial arrived, and Grace and Henry entered the courtroom with a strength they hadn't felt in years. Across from them sat the agency's representatives, their faces tense, their eyes darting nervously as they realized the gravity of the evidence against them. When Anna took the stand, her testimony was unwavering. She recounted in detail the agency's practices, the bribes, the manipulation, and the profit-driven system that had kept Lucas and countless other children from finding permanent, loving homes. The courtroom was silent as she spoke, each word casting a harsh light on the agency's actions. Grace felt her heart swell with hope as she saw the impact of Anna's testimony on the judge, whose face grew increasingly stern. At last, the judge looked directly at the agency's representatives, his expression one of disgust and condemnation. "It is the opinion of this court," he said, his voice ringing with authority, "that the agency has violated the rights of this child and his guardians, putting financial gain above the welfare of those it claims to protect. I hereby revoke the agency's guardianship of Lucas and grant custody to Grace and Henry Thompson." A gasp of relief escaped Grace, and Henry's hand tightened around hers as they both realized the impossible had become real. The judge continued, his tone softening as he looked at Grace and Henry. "Lucas deserves a family, one that has proven time and again their love and commitment to him. I wish you all the peace and happiness that has been so long denied." Grace and Henry rose, their faces shining with joy as the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. But they were barely aware of the noise around them. All they could think of was Lucas, waiting somewhere, unaware that the life he'd longed for, the family he'd prayed for, was now within reach. That evening, as they prepared to bring Lucas home, Grace felt a mix of joy and nervousness. She imagined his face, his laughter, the way he would race through the cottage, filling every corner with life once more. Henry placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, his eyes misty as he spoke. "Grace," he whispered, "we've finally done it. We're bringing our boy home." When they arrived at the foster home to pick up Lucas, he was waiting by the door, his face lighting up the moment he saw them. Without a word, he ran into Grace's arms, clutching her tightly as tears streamed down his face. "You came back for me," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. Grace kissed the top of his head, her own tears falling freely. "We always would, my love. You were never alone. Never." Henry knelt beside them, wrapping them both in a tight embrace. For the first time, they were truly whole, a family reunited after so much loss, their love stronger than any force that had tried to keep them apart. As they drove home, Lucas nestled between Grace and Henry, the soft hum of the engine a lullaby that soothed the ache of years spent apart. And as the lights of the cottage appeared on the horizon, Grace felt a profound peace settle over her, a sense that their journey had finally led them back to where they belonged, together, bound by a love that had survived every trial, every separation, and every painful goodbye. The door of the cottage opened, spilling warm light onto the garden, where the roses bloomed once more, vibrant and alive, welcoming Lucas home. The car pulled up slowly to the little stone cottage, the familiar path lined with roses guiding them home. As soon as the engine stopped, Lucas unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands trembling with excitement, his eyes bright as he looked up at Grace and Henry. The three of them sat in silence for a moment, letting the reality sink in, before Grace reached over and gently took Lucas's hand. "We're home," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Lucas's smile was radiant as he whispered back, "Home." They stepped out together, Lucas bounding up the path with a joy that seemed to fill the whole world. Grace and Henry followed him, their hearts swelling as they watched him run to the garden, his laughter filling the air, a sound they had feared they might never hear again. Grace felt tears slipping down her cheeks as she watched him, her heart brimming with gratitude. She leaned into Henry, who wrapped his arm around her, both of them taking in the sight of Lucas surrounded by the life and love they had fought so hard to reclaim. Inside the cottage, Lucas ran from room to room, his excitement spilling over as he reacquainted himself with every corner, every piece of furniture, every book and toy that had once been part of his everyday life. When he finally made his way to his little bedroom, he stopped at the doorway, his eyes filling with wonder as he saw it just as he'd left it, his bed made up with his favorite quilt, his books lined up on the shelf, his old, beloved teddy bear sitting right in the center. Lucas picked up the bear, hugging it tightly to his chest as he turned to Grace and Henry, his face lit up with joy. "You kept it all here, just for me?" Grace knelt down beside him, her eyes brimming with tears as she held his hand. "Of course we did, Lucas. We knew you'd come back to us. We never stopped believing it." He wrapped his arms around her neck, pressing his face into her shoulder as he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up." Grace hugged him back, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace and love. "You are our son, Lucas. We could never give up on you. Not ever." That evening, the three of them sat by the fire, the warm glow filling the room, casting soft shadows on the walls. Lucas nestled between Grace and Henry, his head resting on Grace's shoulder as she gently stroked his hair. Henry reached over, placing a gentle hand on Lucas's shoulder, the warmth of their touch surrounding him, grounding him in a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. They shared stories, laughter, and even a few tears as they talked about everything they had missed during their time apart. Lucas listened with wide-eyed wonder as Grace told him about the garden they tended, how they'd kept the roses blooming for him, waiting for the day he'd come home to care for them once more. As the evening wore on, Lucas's eyelids began to droop, his body relaxing completely as he nestled deeper into Grace's arms, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the comforting presence of the family he had fought so hard to return to. Grace lifted him gently, carrying him to his room as Henry followed, watching over them both with a quiet smile. Once Lucas was tucked into bed, Grace sat beside him, stroking his hair as he looked up at her with sleepy, contented eyes. "Are you going to stay with me, Grace?" he murmured, his voice soft and drowsy. She smiled, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "Yes, my love. We're together now, and we're not going anywhere. This is your home, forever." Lucas smiled, his eyes closing as he drifted off to sleep, his breathing slowing as he finally found peace. Grace stayed with him, watching him sleep, her heart overflowing with gratitude for the miracle of his return. As the days turned into weeks, Lucas settled back into life at the cottage, rediscovering the simple joys of home. He returned to the garden, tending to the roses with the same gentle care he always had, watching as they blossomed under his touch, vibrant and alive. Grace and Henry watched him with a happiness that filled every corner of their hearts, knowing that their family was whole once more. Each day, Lucas seemed to grow brighter, his laughter filling the cottage, his spirit blossoming like the roses he cared for. The fear and loneliness that had haunted him for so long began to fade, replaced by a sense of belonging, of knowing he was truly home. One afternoon, as they worked together in the garden, Lucas looked up at Grace, his expression thoughtful. "Grace," he asked, his voice quiet but steady, "why did you keep fighting for me? Even when they said I couldn't come home?" Grace knelt beside him, taking his small hands in hers as she looked into his eyes, her own filled with love. "Because you're our family, Lucas. Love doesn't let go, no matter what. No matter how far apart we were, you were always in our hearts. And as long as there was a chance to bring you home, we weren't going to stop fighting." Lucas smiled, his heart swelling with the understanding that he was cherished, that he was worth every fight, every tear, every difficult moment. That night, after dinner, they sat by the fire once again, sharing stories of the future they dreamed of, the places they wanted to visit, the memories they planned to make. Lucas's eyes sparkled as he talked about his dreams, the adventures he wanted to have, and Grace and Henry listened with hearts full of pride, knowing they would be there to support him every step of the way. Years passed, and Lucas grew into a young man, strong and confident, with a heart as warm and compassionate as the love he had received. Grace and Henry watched with pride as he carried their lessons forward, his spirit as unbreakable as the bond they had fought so hard to protect. One summer evening, Lucas sat with them in the garden, his gaze resting on the roses that had become a symbol of their journey, of the resilience that had brought them together. He reached over, taking Grace's hand and then Henry's, holding them both as he looked at the life they had created together. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "For everything. For showing me that love never gives up." Grace squeezed his hand, her eyes filled with tears, her heart swelling with gratitude. "Thank you, Lucas. You taught us just as much about love, about hope, about never giving up. You're the greatest blessing we could ever have." And as the sun set over the cottage, casting a golden glow over the roses and filling the garden with warmth, they sat together, knowing that their journey had come full circle. They were a family, bound by love, strengthened by loss, and made whole by the unwavering faith that had guided them through every hardship. In that moment, they understood that they had found something more precious than anything life could offer, or a home filled with love, a heart healed, and a future that would forever be bright with hope.